850 collieries owned by the nation. Over 220 million tons of coal a year. 700,000 men and boys, miners, but all specialists, hewers, fillers, shot firers, deputies, haulage men. The longest coal road, 3 miles or more from pit bottom. The deepest workings, 4,000 feet, as deep as Ben Nevis is high. And it all began 900 years ago. "900 years ago. From the beaches of Northumberland, Durham, and the Firth of Forth, sea coal was gathered. The seams outcropped on the sea's edge, and lumps of coal were washed ashore like any other rock. The coal was gathered for the monks to use in their workshops. And for 150 years after the Norman conquest, we know no more of its history. Then, from the great monasteries and abbeys of the northeast, news of coal was carried by pilgrims traveling from one part of the country to another. By 1270, coastal ships had started to bear the new fuel from Tyneside to as far south as London. Where the coal lay near the surface, they dug trenches to get it. And then coal mining developed. 2 kinds of mine were used. One was sunk into an outcrop of coal from the surface. It was known as a bell pit because of its shape. The other was a drift mine, driven into the hillside or river bank where the coal seam emerged. The bell pits were sunk where the seam lay only a few yards below the surface. One man, a pitman as he was already called, would dig out the coal with a helper, usually his wife, to fetch and carry. The pits were crude with no supports. As much coal as possible was hewn before the sides threatened to cave in. The pit would then be abandoned and another started nearby. One of the ancient laws of the Forest of Dean had fixed that a second pit should be at a distance to which a miner could throw a shovel full of rubbish from the pit he had worked out. In the drift mines, 2 or 3 miners won the coal, while boys or women dragged it to the entrance. Then the need for coal increased. By the 14th century, artisans were using it extensively in their workshops. And in 1367, it was allowed to be exported to Calais. So these hillside workings were often extended deeper. The coal was easy to get as only the best and the thickest seams were worked. They were threatened by only two dangers: water and stale air. Stale air, choke damp which could suffocate and kill. The only sign of its presence was the slowly dimming candle. If seen in time, it could be dispersed by fanning the air, which the miner would do with his jacket or any piece of cloth kept handy for the purpose. Then water, a problem that was to remain with coal mining for the next 600 years. Steadily and constantly, it seeped down from the surface into the coal faces, and at times threatened to make them unworkable. In this primitive stage of coal mining history, the water was drained away along small tunnels or adits, driven to the end of the drift from the hillside or river bank at a point lower than the main entrance. This also helped to ventilate the mine and reduce the danger from choke damp. As the workings moved further in, shorter routes were essential for the men, the coal, and the air. Steep slopes or landways were driven. And then, as the seams went deeper, vertical shafts were sunk, the first real pit shafts. And this was to mean new problems in bringing up the coal. During the past 4 centuries, the mining of coal had developed slowly but steadily in almost every coal field that is worked today. Tyneside, Coaly Tyne as Milton later called it, was the largest. In fact, by Tudor times, there were 400 vessels in the Tyne coal fleet. In Elizabeth's reign, coal had been very unpopular. Her Majesty findeth herself greatly grieved and annoyed with the taste and the smoke of the sea coals. But as Britain's sea power grew, wood was needed in vast quantities for shipbuilding and for smelting iron for arms, armor, and cannon. The charcoal needed for smelting 1 ton of iron destroyed a whole acre of woodland. Parliament had to decree that the burning of wood be restricted despite the Queen's displeasure. In the towns, the wood fire became almost wholly a luxury of the nobility. But James I had no objection to coal, and in the 17th century it became fashionable by royal favor. So coal mining had become an industry. Pits were made larger and deeper, sometimes as much as 200 or 300 feet below ground. Increasing numbers of women and children were employed to drag the weighty loads along the rough and sometimes steep roadways. manpower was still the only form of underground transport. But for winding, simple machines were already in use. This cog and rung gin worked by a horse was developed in Cromwell's time. But it left no room at the pit head. An improvement was the whim gin, set up at a little distance from the pit head. From a vertical drum, a strong hemp rope ran over a pulley and so down the shaft. But still the only power was a horse. Coal mining had become an industry before industrial power was available. This device allowed several cores to be hoisted at once, one above the other. In time, several horses could be used when the pits became deeper. And as the miners dug deeper into the rock, they met a new danger. Now, if choke damp was present and the miner tried to disperse it, he would often waft an explosive mixture of fire damp and air onto his candle. Another dangerous sort of bad air, but of a fiery nature like lightning, which blasts and tears all before it if it take hold of the candle. Men and workings were destroyed by one explosion after another. The only solution was to fire the gas deliberately. Several times a day, firemen, as they were most aptly called, would enter the mine, and each in his own way would prepare to fire the pockets of gas. Here, one would hide himself in a shallow hole beneath some timber. Another, often called the penitent, from the monk-like nature of his protective rags, would approach the area of danger with a candle on a pole. Then, in one way or another, the gas would be ignited. So the mine was made safe for a few hours. But the problem of water was more serious at this time. Adits could not be used where the belt of coal lay deep under the surface. Something was needed to lift the water out of the mine. Many ingenious machines to do this were produced in the 17th century. One method was to adapt a horse gin to turn a chain of buckets, as used in the Middle East today for irrigation. More complex inventions followed. For this was a golden century of art and science, the century of Milton, Wren, Newton, and the Royal Society. The machines of this age were the prologue to the Industrial Revolution. But they were made of wood and wore out too quickly. Their only power was by water, wind, or horse, and this was not enough as the mines became still deeper. Coal owners spent more and more money on drainage, and the price of coal rose alarmingly. The constant, steady seepage of water threatened mine after mine with closure. One gloomy prophet in the House of Commons complained that the pits would be flooded before the 20 years' lease of the mines expired. But he had not reckoned with the genius of the engineers. As the century closed, man harnessed nature in the shape of steam. 1698, a patent was granted to Captain Savory for a new invention, driven by the impellent force of fire, which will be of great use for draining of mines. Savory was not to succeed, but Thomas Newcomen, some 15 years later, produced a practical engine. At Griff Colliery, the first mechanically propelled machine was installed for pumping water. It replaced 50 horses and saved 750 pounds a year. These engines had to be made by craftsmen in the traditional materials, wood, copper, and lead. Iron was still too scarce to be used. Over 100 of these machines had been installed in the north of England alone by the middle of the 18th century. Then a new partnership arose. Abraham Darby perfected the coking of coal and used it in the smelting of iron. From 1740 onwards, iron was produced cheaply and plentifully by the use of coal, and in its turn, iron helped to produce more coal. With cheap iron, the steam engine was rapidly improved, although its only function was to pump water and to drain the mines. And with cheap iron, haulage in the coal fields was transformed. Until now, almost the only improvement underground had been a wheelbarrow on planks. This had been used for centuries. Wooden wheels on wooden rails were another idea of the 17th century. Now came iron, and railways improved. Above ground, the rail system in the collieries advanced even more rapidly, and level haulages often ran for several miles. Where the ground sloped, the empty wagons would be pulled up to the pit bank by the full ones which ran down under their own weight on a self-acting inclined plane. Sometimes a horse would pull up the empties. To save the horse unnecessary walking, a special wagon was provided to take him on the downward journey. A privilege, we are told, that the horse highly appreciated. But these railways seldom carried the coal more than a few miles, usually to the nearest seaport or waterway. Canals were built to carry the coal further afield in horse-drawn barges. But horsepower was not enough for this expanding industry. The sun and planet gear was devised by James Watt in 1782. Now, rotary motion made it possible for stationary steam engines to raise coal and to draw wagons. A new engineering age had begun. Iron, coal, and steam made the last years of the 18th century the starting point of the modern world. Idea followed idea. If steam could turn wheels, why not a steam engine on wheels? Trevithick made the first attempt. He used the same principles as in stationary engines. Blenkinsop carried the idea forward, and the first practical locomotive drew coal at Middleton Colliery. So the coal fields became the birthplace of the railways. Now the Industrial Revolution neared its peak. Coal mining boomed. In the 100 years after the Battle of Trafalgar, production per year was to grow from 10 million tons to 225 million tons. To get it meant a vast increase in manpower.
I carry the large bits of coal from the wall face to the pit bottom. The weight is usually 100 weight. I don't know how many pounds that is, but it's some weight to carry.
I've naught to do but sit and open a door with a bend to it. I never see daylight now, except on Sundays.
I push the coves along the tram road. It tires me at night, in my back and shoulders and all over.
I don't like it because it's dark and being in so many hours. I don't play at all, but sometimes I whistle.
Collier people suffer much more than others. My good man died 9 years since with bad vapour. He was entirely off work 11 years before he died.
I hold the riddle and have to shake the slack out of it, and then throw the rest into the corf. It's very hard work. I've been lamed in the ankle and strained in my back.
You must just tell the Queen Victoria that women people here don't mind work, but they object to horsework. She would have the blessing of all the Scottish coal women if she could get them out of the pits.
Neither drainage nor ventilation are sufficiently attended to for the health and comfort of the work people in a majority of cases. While in some, the ventilation is so imperfect that it's positively dangerous.
Fire damp remained the gravest danger. Miners became skilled in detecting its presence by the flames of their naked candles. But even so, every week several miners and boys were killed or burnt by fire and explosion. Perhaps the steel mill was the answer, an invention of Carlisle Spedding, one of the great names in coal mining history. It was a steel wheel turned against a piece of flint, lighting the workings with a shower of sparks, which were thought to be not hot enough to ignite the fire damp. It was as dangerous as the candle. Even the phosphorescent light of putrefying fish skins, miners were ready to try any extreme. They might as well have worked with no light at all, as indeed they sometimes did. But when explosives were used for blasting coal and a hand drill was the only tool, a good light was essential. In any case, as the fuse was only a slender hollow stalk filled with powder, a candle was needed to light it. With the blasting of coal came a new hazard: explosive coal dust. Disaster followed disaster. Within 2 years, 600 men were killed in Tyne and Weir. In 1812, at Felling Colliery, 92 men were killed. Something had to be done. The Sunderland Society was formed for the sole purpose of finding a remedy. It appealed to Sir Humphrey Davy for help. Within a year, he produced a lamp, which he and others who believed in it took underground to prove to the miners that it could be used in a fiery pit without igniting the gas. "It is," he said, "the best thing I ever did." But a magistrate said,
I have always been of the opinion that though Davy's lamp was a valuable discovery, it has in practice been much abused, for it has enabled colliers to work where they otherwise ought not. I wish to add that when it is used, an explosion may be produced by the imprudence of any single individual.
The only safety is a perfect ventilation. Fire baskets were the first artificial means of ventilation. They were lowered down a shaft. The fire caused the air to rise in that shaft and to circulate in the workings. These fire baskets later became huge furnaces placed near to the base of the upcast shaft and were in use until the coming of mechanical fans. As the mines became bigger, the working faces only were supplied with a flow of air. But this left large parts of the mine unventilated, and they filled up with dangerous pockets of gas. Then, by the use of ventilation doors and brick stoppings, the air was made to circulate throughout the whole mine. But in doing so, it had to travel so far that it became highly charged with gas and would often explode when it reached the furnace. A remedy for this danger was put forward by an anonymous writer who called himself a rational friend to schemes of improvement. He suggested dividing the mine into a greater number of independent systems of ventilation, so disposed that each wagon road should form part of an air course. The great John Buddle put this system into practice and brought about a revolution in the ventilation of coal mines. At last, the safety of the men who won the coal was slowly catching up with other advances. Below ground, ventilation became better and safety lights were improved. But traveling in the shaft was still terrifying and dangerous. In Scotland, women still climbed over 100 feet to the surface by ladders. Men descended clinging to ropes like a living chandelier. But guide rails brought greater safety, and 2 shafts became the rule. For the next 50 years, invention followed invention, all adding to safety in the shaft. The 19th century drew to an end with the steam engine still supreme. The old queen died. In 1900, 225 million tons of coal were won by 1 million workers, although they used their hands and simple tools. But they were still working in good seams. Now the good seams were beginning to run out. Horses were no longer adequate. Steam engines were immobile, and compressed air had seemed to be the only answer. Then electricity entered the mine, lighting the faces and promising power for cutting coal. For already men had invented machines to do this. They only needed a force to drive them. The 50 years that changed the car and the aeroplane from supernatural instruments before whose miracles we used to stand amazed into objects which we now employ without giving them a thought, saw the same dramatic changes in the mechanization of coal mining. Mining is still a battle between man and the solid rock. Only the weapons have changed. Despite all the inventions and improvements, the principles of winning the coal are still the same as they were when the history of coal mining began 9 centuries ago.